And today we're going to be talking about specifically what is capitalism. And I might just start it off. I was going to go into a story, but we might just start it off with Michael. Michael, can you, what is capitalism to you?
Well, the definition of capitalism is private ownership of the means of production, but a definition is not the concept. So I'd like to kind of expand on that private ownership of the means of production and what it actually entails. And I think that when you're talking private, first of all, it means individual, not the state. The state is not owning things, people are. And I think in order to own things, we have to start off with the concept of self-ownership, meaning I own my body, I own my mind, I own my thoughts, they're mine, and the things that I'm able to produce are an extension of that. So I think that once we get that off the ground, we understand that, for instance, because an argument is frequently made against capitalism. Well, capitalism allowed for slavery. Well, if private ownership stems from self-ownership, then obviously slavery would be a violation of that. And then we'd have to go on to how is it? I think that we need to discuss why is capitalism better than other things? Why is it better than socialism? Why is it better than the welfare state? And my simple answer to that is it's better for people to own themselves and to own their own property and the fruits of their own labor than it is for somebody else to own those things, because then you get into rights violations. And I don't think that's a good thing for anybody. And I think most people know that when somebody violates their rights, they understand it. But a lot of people seem to be okay with violating the rights of others. That's just a short definition. Obviously, we're going to need to expand on it. But as a quick primer, that to me is the base of capitalism, is it's rooted in self-ownership.
Sure. So some people might say, like if you go back in the past, some people might say, well, we have the rights to own slaves, and this is where the definition of rights becomes a little bit muddled. Can you talk about rights? What is it? What exactly is a right?
Okay, well, according to the dictionary, a right is a moral or a just claim to something. So in order to have a moral claim to something, obviously you need a morality, which is why politics is derivative. It's not a primary. And it ultimately is derived from a view of ethics. So we'd have to ask, well, what is ethics and what's the proper ethical standard and what are proper ethical guidelines? And I think unequivocally that Ayn Rand has provided a scientific code of ethics that's firmly rooted in reality. So Miss Rand starts off with saying, what are values? Because we back up just a little bit. A code of ethics is a code of values to guide people's behavior. So then you have to ask, well, what are values? And does a person need them? And she clearly showed that the concept of value, of what is good or bad, is genetically dependent on life. Without life, you don't have good or bad. You don't have something for which other things can be good or bad. And that's because life is the only entity on the planet or in the universe that can go out of existence. Matter and energy are simply transformed into other things. They don't cease to exist. Life does cease to exist. Furthermore, value implies action, that you can do. The value ultimately means something desirable as a means or ends in itself. That translated into desirable means worth seeking. So seeking is obviously something that only living organisms can do. And then you say, well, what are they seeking? And are these things harming them or not? Now, once you extend from, so organisms and animals and, plants, you end up with human life. And humans differ from these other entities in that we have the capacity for choice. We can actually choose to go against what's good or bad for us, whereas other entities cannot. And given that we can choose, we can fail. So we have to discover those things that we should pursue. So now the question comes to me now, back to rights. If a right is something that we have a moral or just claim to, it seems unequivocal to me that if it's a moral claim, we must have a right to that which gives rise to the concept of morality, which is our own lives. So that's, in my view, and that's not explicitly Rand's view. I want to be clear that I differ with her slightly, not fundamentally, but derivatively, I do differ from her a little bit. So I don't want anybody looking and say, that's not what Rand said. I know it's not. That's my view derived from hers. And I think that's what I've explained, I believe, where the right to life comes from. And from that, that's where the self-ownership concept comes from. And that's where our right to property comes from. Because if we have a right to our lives, we must have a right to sustain them. And property is the necessity in order to sustain our lives. I hope that's clear. If it's not, feel free to ask and I'll clear it up as best I can. And I know it's a complex topic.
Yeah, that was very clear to me. And just based on what Michael had said, Carlos, I'm just going to ask a question. Do you think the society that we are living in today is a moral society?
I don't think it's a moral society at all. I think that for me personally, I was raised in a home where nobody ever worked. And there were 8 of us. We always had food, we always had Christmas presents, and we had every single game system you can imagine that came out. So I wondered where that money came from. I was never told. As I grew up, I understood that there was such a thing as a welfare system. I didn't understand the moral concept or the moral significance of it at the time. But when I went to prison at the age of 15, I never had a job. I had no skills at all. And I met Brent McCall, who was a great friend of Mike and mine. And he taught me about carpentry. And through learning about the principles of carpentry, I was able to develop skills that also provided me with a wage. Now, I started at 30 cents. The kind of competency that I showed over the years allowed me to go all the way to $1.50. Now, a lot of people may not think that that is significant, but I just want to stress the fact that involved in that was a development of providing for myself that I didn't have before. And through developing that, I was able to understand that I needed to provide for myself in order to get all of the things that I needed. So, for example, I had to pay a monthly payment of $52 because I enrolled in college. Nobody else was going to pay that for me if I didn't pay it. And then I also had other responsibilities in terms of providing for myself that nobody else was going to provide. So I started to understand that if I depended on other people, I was going to deprive myself of the opportunity to develop the kind of skills I needed to be successful in life. Now, I started to ask myself the question, well, if I don't provide for myself, how then am I going to be able to get this money? And I go back to my child and I remember this is exactly what was going on. My mother and my father decided they weren't going to work because they were going to be provided for. And I saw what that did to them in terms of their ideas about life. They actually felt that it wasn't just wrong to work, but they also had a contempt and a resentment for people who earned their own living. Now, with the example, I had a son as well, and his mother followed suit. And she's still to this day depending on the government to provide her with a substance of income. And now that created a situation where my son couldn't get a job because his mother would be punished by raising her rent. So now the cycle continued, and my son also decided that it was a bad thing to work, not only to not put more responsibility on his mother, but not to make her feel bad. And so now it creates this generational culture where everybody believes that working is wrong and that being provided by the government is the right thing to do. And so I see this cycle repeating itself over and over and over. And when I tell them that it's a great thing to work, that it's a great thing to be independent because they don't have a right to claim anybody else's wealth, they look at me like I'm the crazy one. And so that just, no, it's not a moral society at all, in no way.
Yeah, well, we've all been there. We've all been there where we pointed out, where does the money come from? And, you know, people just think the government has money without taking a step back to think that somebody's working and putting it in there through taxes, and it's involuntary, and it is, as you said, an immoral system. Just a little bit of a story on my family. So my dad was actually born in a very, very poor part, in very poor circumstances, extremely poor circumstances. My grandmother was married out at 14. She was 14 years old because her family couldn't feed her, and she had 12 children, 7 of them died, 5 of them survived. My dad was one of the ones that survived, and they were just living on the farm. Back then, this was Cyprus back in the 1950s. It was under British Empire at that time, and all the, they were farmers. They were sheep farmers. They used to raise sheep, and they had hardly anything to eat. That's why 7 of their children died. Even though they had sheep and things like that, they actually sold a lot of the stuff to try and keep the sheep alive. And they were very, very poor. My family now, the Ioannou side of the family, my dad's side of the family, are now pretty wealthy. And the way that they became wealthy was through capitalism. And it started off with one of my uncles finding a metal sheet and making it into a plug that goes. It was basically an electrical part that he partnered with electrical companies and sold them this little part. At first, he started making them by hand, and then all of the other brothers got involved. And then they started to bring machines from France to make it for them. And before you know it, the whole family is employed. And this is, capitalism is actually the difference between animals and humans. Animals will actually destroy their environment. So if there's, they will only eat the food that is there and then starve to death. Whereas humans can actually change their environment. This is a difference between animals and humans. They will change their environment to suit them. And one of the ways that they can change their environment is through through capitalistic measures, like creating industries and creating empires and being able to trade. So if we take all of that away, if we take all of that consciousness that creates that away, and I'll go back to my original ancestors, who were very poor, if they didn't have that consciousness to be able to create their environment and get themselves out of poverty through capitalism, the most they could have done is grab that iron ore and crack coconuts with it or something, until they were all gone, and then they would have starved to death. So capitalism is actually a way for us to create our environment. Instead of being at the effect of the environment, we create the life that we want. And like Michael said, it is based on morality, and you're responsible for your own life. There is no other. Well, there are animals that actually would depend on other animals, and that's they're scavengers or they're parasites. Scavengers are the ones that will wait around for a hunter to hunt, and then they will eat the leftovers, which is basically what happens in society. Or they will go, one step further and become parasites, where they actually attach and become totally dependent. One observation that I've made through biology is, and I like to always relate it back to something that's natural, so that I can understand what it is. One of the observations that I've made is scavengers are always are in big groups, whereas hunters hunt alone. And I think that's actually the difference between something like a capitalist. A capitalist can actually create their life alone, whereas socialism requires large numbers to actually be effective. And this is why things like, Stand in Your Power, or the Ayn Rand groups, or even the Todd Feinberg show are really important in creating that kind of awareness around being independent and being responsible for your own life, and telling people that they can be responsible for your own life. I believe that everyone can actually be responsible for their own life. There are people with no arms and no legs that are going out there doing public speaking and doing some wonderful stuff, within their own capabilities, and being able to create the life that they want.
You have on. Can you tell us anything about the necklace before I move on? It's very interesting.
My mum gave it to me. This is the first time I wore it, so I don't wear it out in public because it's a bit heavy. But she's going to see the video later and think that, you know, my daughter likes what I give her.
Well, that's great. That's great.
Thank you.
So you said a lot, and one of the thing that I really enjoy about the concept of capitalism, and it's illustrated in both the story that Carlos told and the story that you told, it allows the best to rise to the top. And by best, I'm talking about in terms of Ayn Rand's ethics. Like a John Galt, for instance, although a fictional character in Atlas Shrugged, nonetheless, it's a personality that rises to the top when he's free to do so. And I think that that's very important. Now, you also said something about the hunter and the difference between a hunter and a scavenger. And it's true. Ayn Rand herself said that on a desert island by himself, man would need morality, that he would still need it because morality is ultimately surviving and doing your best to thrive. And you would need that. You'd have to figure it out with your rational mind under any circumstances. But I would say this, she also talked about the advantages of social relationships. And she said the great advantages of social relationships are knowledge and trade, in that we can transmit knowledge both from one to another, but also through time, so that we don't have to learn everything anew. And the trade aspect is enormous, because as we talked about, as capitalism ultimately is rooted in self-ownership and then the private ownership of property, in that I don't have to create all the property that I'm going to need in order to thrive and survive. So I don't have to be the individual hunter or the individual on a desert island. I can specialize and I can create a product that other people want in capitalism, and then I can trade that. So if I want that lovely necklace, for instance, perhaps I can create a phone. I can't, of course, but I'm not that smart. But suppose I could, then I can create an abundance of phones, and then I can trade them off for things like that necklace, or Carlos's, I think he's wearing a sweatshirt, but it's a long sleeve shirt under any case. But by doing that, you end up with more products and more services created, and that's how we end up thriving as a people. Now, it's important, I want to address this, that the justification for capitalism is there's essentially two arguments. One of the arguments is utilitarian in nature, and that is that under capitalism, it allows the greatest number of people to thrive. That even people, for instance, that aren't great producers end up living at a higher standard of living than they otherwise would. This is true, no doubt. But Ayn Rand held, and I agree with her, that that is not the justification for capitalism. The other justification for capitalism is rooted in John Locke's argument for property rights, in that capitalism ultimately is the moral system. It was elucidated by Locke and then by the French political philosopher Frederick Bastiat, that we have a right to life, liberty, and property, and the purpose of government is to protect those things. The problem with Locke and Bastiat, in my view, is that they rooted their concept of rights not in reality, but in that they come from God. And without having that moral base in reality, they were lacking substantially. Ayn Rand provided that link to reality. With her concept of ethics, which is derived from the nature of man, she has created a sound argument for the capitalist system, and that the capitalist system is the only one that protects our rights. And she would argue that the fundamental justification for capitalism is that it does that. It protects people's rights. It allows people to thrive and survive. And it needs no further justification. The fact that it does create the greatest standard of living for the most people, to her and to me, is an ancillary benefit, but it's not the primary justification.
Yeah, for sure. And look, you've touched on relationships. So relationships can either be parasitic or symbiotic, and I think capitalism is a symbiotic relationship because it uses volition, whereas other things either are parasitic or scavenging. I think they're scavenging because they actually depend on somebody else being a capitalist. And if you look at social systems or socialist systems that are working, they're working to the degree that the capitalism in that society is actually working. If that capitalism actually, if they manage to destroy it, and they do eventually destroy it, then the whole system falls apart, because socialism can't actually make money.
Yeah, there's nobody left to loot.
Yes, exactly. So if you look at countries like the Nordic systems, and people say, the Nordic systems actually work, and it's not socialism that's actually working in those countries. It's actually capitalism is working. They've set it up in a way where capitalism is destroyed a lot less slowly, so they can milk it for longer. And
That's funny.
and they're doing it in a way where they have privatized a lot of things. There is no minimum wage. There is a lot of capitalism going on, and then they've got these high taxes. But they've got a system that keeps capitalists interested to keep providing money, and that is why it's working for longer. It would work indefinitely if it was a laissez-faire capitalist system. And over to you, Carlos, actually, to explain what that is. What is laissez-faire?
Well, my understanding of it is that it's complete non-interference of the government. And I want to touch a little bit though on the thing you mentioned about relationships, and also about killing capitalism slowly so that they can milk it for longer. And I've been in spaces, especially academic spaces, where my professors have constantly attacked capitalism and the students have attacked capitalism. And I'm the only one in the room defending it. And nobody's realizing that in order to hold on to my position, I don't have to do anything except continue to claim that capitalism is the best system. Whereas their position, it will require them to not only give up their jobs, oppose any kind of production process, and so on and so forth. And it boggles my mind that they attack every single thing that their life depends on, but none of them are willing to actually follow it through practically to its conclusion. Does that make sense to you?
It
Yes.
makes perfect sense. And actually, Ludwig von Mises made a similar observation, in that the intellectual class, the class that is most virulently attacks capitalism, their very existence is dependent on capitalism, which has created a standard of living that allows them to pontificate from their ivory towers. Whereas if the capitalist system was gone, they'd have to be out foraging and hunting in the woods. He didn't put that. I added that in for a little rhetorical flourish, but that was nonetheless his point.
Yeah, but it makes total sense. It makes total sense. And one of the things that actually keeps it, I have been looking at this system for over a year, trying to work out, why are people so stupid? Why are people so indoctrinated that they cannot see what is going on and where the money is actually coming from? And it has to be that they are weaponizing. There is a system, and it's probably the socialist governments that are actually weaponizing jealousy. So
Xenia, I'll tell you what, and I'm going to keep bringing this up because my whole life was spent in prison. So I think it's important to throw that out. If the audience is wondering why, it's because I was sent to prison at the age of 15 and spent 24 years there. And so my reality was everything that surrounded me. I didn't know how to think. And even more, I didn't have the kind of courage that was required to go against everything that was telling me that the world operated in a certain manner. And I remember that a Muslim told me one day, he said, "What is your religion?" I said, "I am Christian." He said, "Why are you Christian?" My answer to that was, because my parents are Christian, because everyone around me who I know is Christian. And he told me, "Well, if your parents worship fish, would you worship fish?" And I've never thought of such a thing before. So I think that it's not necessarily that people are stupid. I think that has a lot to do with it as well. I'm not going to discount that. But I think that in my experience of having to go against a culture that taught me that women were to be objectified, that self-sacrifice was the key to success, that I didn't have a right to think about my own way of seeing life and acting on it, that I was responsible for the actions of other people, so on and so forth. All those things that I grew up with thinking that were true, when I started to challenge them, I found only two people on my corner, which was Mike and Brent, that actually encouraged me to continue thinking the way I was thinking and living it out as well. So I think there's a great fear of standing alone, when in reality, I found that standing alone is the thing that actually makes change, because you're able to convince people who try to live off a morality that they know doesn't function at all. They destroy their lives and they try to take everybody else down with them, but they always look for the person that can provide them with the kind of energy to continue destroying themselves. And they can't get that from the culture they're living in. So they look with contempt on those who are being successful, who have an optimistic view of life, and who are trying to do their best to get the hell away from what they're doing.
Xenia, I like what you said about, I think you called it jealousy. Ayn Rand referred to it as envy, and I would highly suggest that anybody watching read her essay, The Age of Envy. But as far as why people accept socialism, my friend Brent McCall, I think, would agree with you, that Brent, that Carlos just mentioned. He has a universal postulate of human behavior is that people are stupid. What happened?
Xenia,
Yes. Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Why are you
you
throwing
muted
up a timeout
everybody.
sign?
Sorry?
Huh?
Sorry?
You muted everybody.
Can you hear me?
There you go. Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you just ruined everything. Thanks a lot, pal. I was in the
No,
middle. I had a nice flow going, and you wrecked it.
no. She
My
muted
pleasure.
everybody, buddy. They couldn't hear
Yeah,
you either.
my pleasure. Go on, Michael. Was that it?
No, I don't know where we got muted and where we didn't.
So you
But
started
back
off by
to,
saying that Brent
I
would
didn't
agree
touch
with it.
anything, but yeah. Go on. So
I could hear you, Carlos. I don't know what you're talking about, but Brent
yeah,
McCall had a saying that people are stupid. But
so,
that notwithstanding,
we've got a lot of interference of free markets.
we do. But I want to just say, you asked why people are inclined to accept socialism. And I think it has deeper roots than the simple idea that people are stupid. Ayn Rand said that the basic problem is that people have accepted an ethic of altruism, of self-sacrifice, that we ought to live for others.
Mm.
And once people accept that notion, then even a person who succeeds and does well, even if their behavior is benefiting others, the fact that it's not their intent leads people to hate them, despise them, and that largely is why they despise capitalism. In the Stand Your Power chat room, which I rather enjoy, by the way, you posed the question as who helped other people more, Bill Gates or Mother Teresa. And my issue with the question is that it supports the altruist ethic that capitalism is supposed to be justified by helping other people. But in fact, capitalism, in my view, is justified by the fact that it allows people to help themselves, regardless of what the ancillary benefit is to others. And once you accept the altruistic ethic, then it doesn't matter really how many people are benefited by somebody's self-interest, because they're motivated by self-interest. So somebody would still judge them negatively. That's why I think that fundamentally I agree with Ms. Rand that we have to overcome and defeat altruism as the ethical base behind so many of our institutions.
Yeah, true. That question was actually aimed at bringing people in. If you look at it back to biology, in the selfish quest to make honey, bees are responsible for all of existence, correct? So they're not aiming to be responsible for all of existence. They just are self-interest to exist for themselves. And in doing so, are responsible for all of, well, not responsible, but indirectly responsible for all of society. And an example is okay, so let's go back to my own family. They've discovered this little plug that goes at the back of some electrical thing. I don't even know what it is, but in doing that and expanding that and having the self-interest to make money for themselves, they ended up employing not only their own family, but they have employed people in France to make them custom machines. You know, and it just goes on and on. If we look at something like Coca-Cola, you know, it started off with one person having an idea, and it expanded into, you know, sugarcane plantations and trucks delivering and supermarkets. And, you know, this is how capitalism is. And I think capitalism actually mimics nature. You know, behind me is a lot of plants, you know, that are growing, and they're all growing for themselves. They have a biological self-interest to grow for themselves. But there are other plants, there are some plants that are made to be shade plants. And, you know, they only grow under trees, which means that a tree that is growing for itself has to exist for the other ones to grow under it, or grow on it, or climb on it. And I think capitalism is the closest thing that will mimic nature. It is exactly like nature. So it works with everything existing for itself, and everything else depending on that thing existing for itself, if that even makes sense.
No, I think it does, and Mike can pick up on this after. The way I see it and I understand it is that the reason why we're engaged in self-preservation is because we have to maintain that life. And so the way I think about it is, I have no choice in whether my heart beats or not. I have no choice in the fact that my body is processing toxins and filtering them out, and so on and so forth. And when I ask people, you know, what happens when you drink poison? Their immediate response to me is, oh, well, you die. But in reality, what ends up happening is that your body starts releasing these antigens, I think they're called, in order to start attacking the venom to try to survive. So in that particular aspect, we have no choice. Our bodies are geared to self-sustain themselves. So when I think about going into business, I don't see how it's possible to tell somebody that your limitation should be at a certain amount of wealth. Because really, you're not trying to get $10,000, $100 million. You're just trying to keep the business afloat the way you're trying to stay alive in the real world. And so when you create something that requires you to continually feed it in order to stay alive, then you're going to want to continue engaging in the kind of actions that's going to sustain it, that's going to make it grow, so on and so forth. So when people attack billionaires and millionaires and so on, and they say, oh, you know, he's got too much money, they skip and they jump the gun and don't consider the fact that these men, say, you know, Steve Jobs in a garage, and there are also other examples that we can draw on. These men didn't say, you know, what does it take to make $1 billion? They say, what does it take to get this idea into practice and turn it into a business and generate some income? And then they took those steps and eventually ended up becoming wealthy. So, you know, this whole concept that people have about what capitalism is supposed to represent, as if it was apart from the very life that requires us to live in a particular way, in a way that is, you know, great for our own well-being, it doesn't make sense at all. But I'm sure Mike will clarify that a little bit more.
I'm a little confused, but I think I got it. I believe, let me go back to Xenia for a second. I believe that what Xenia was saying as far as capitalism mimicking nature is that in capitalism, human beings are free. And when we're free without interference, we're allowed to live according to our nature as rational beings. We don't have force operating on us, forcing us to go against our desires or against what we want to do. We're acting naturally. I think that's what Xenia was saying. Now, as far as what you just said, I believe what you're talking about, Carlos, is that biological systems don't operate volitionally. Biological systems operate automatically to sustain the lives of us, our lungs, our heart, all the organisms and whatnot that live within us are striving to maintain us. Organs, I should have said, not organisms. They're striving to maintain us, and that does that automatically. Now, our consciousness operates volitionally. We have to make the choice to discover morality, to act according to its tenets, to maintain ourselves. I think that's what you were getting at, is you were identifying the difference between automatic self-preservation systems and the volitional faculty, which we have to operate by choice and choose to live. Am I correct? Did I misstate either of your positions? If so, please let me know.
No, no, you're right, and I think you know, we should go a little bit into that because Ayn Rand said that, you know, she's not praising capitalism in and of itself. She actually is an advocate of capitalism because it's a result of the rational philosophy that she developed with regards to men and reason
Yeah.
and possessing reason.
Yeah. Yes, what she said was that I'm not primarily a defender of capitalism, and this is not a quote, it's a paraphrase. She said, I'm not primarily a defender of capitalism, I'm a defender of egoism. And I'm not primarily a defender of egoism, I'm a defender of
Yes.
reason. And egoism and capitalism are derivatives of reason.
It's all about freedom. It's all
Well, the
about
rational
freedom,
faculty depends on freedom to operate properly. Yes.
which we don't have at the moment, which is the reason why we are having all of these discussions, because we don't have freedom, and a lot of people cannot see that we don't have freedom.
Well, I would say you're absolutely correct. But I mean, and I don't know much about Australia, but I know in America, you know, our top income tax bracket, I think, is upwards, I think it's 37%. 37% of somebody's income is being taken from them. That's absurd. That's pure robbery. It's nothing else. I've known plenty of people in prison for doing the same thing, but for some reason, when people disconnect themselves from the process and vote somebody in a suit to pass a law, they think they're not doing the same thing. They are. And, you know, that's not even talking about the variety of regulations and other taxes, state, local, federal, that we have. So no, I wouldn't say we're a free country, or I don't think there's any free country. That's not to say, because I can hear people yelling, well, you know, it's freer than some places. Of course it is. Of course, in the United States, I have more liberties than people have in Cuba. There's no doubt about it. But is that really what we want to compare ourselves to? No, we want to establish an ideal and reach for it. Just like in my personal life, I may not be perfect ethically, but I want to be. So I'm going to strive to achieve it. I'm not going to compare myself to some degenerate who's out there shooting heroin out of mud puddles. What I'm going to do is compare myself to the ideal that I want to become. And it's the same thing with the society I want to live in. I want to live in a free society where people are free to make their own choices according to their own decisions. That's it. Not according to their own decisions, where they can make their own decisions according to their own judgment. I'm sorry, I got excited and got ahead of myself for a second. I think it was the necklace. It threw me off.
I think it's ironic that we're advocating freedom as a political policy, where freedom should actually be freedom. Because
you're going to have to elaborate. I don't understand.
Well,
what do you mean?
Well, people think that their rights actually extend to the rights of other people. So, you know, they, you know, for example, Bill Gates. Okay, so he's made billions of dollars. So the whole socialist argument is he made billions of dollars. He owes it to society. So therefore, freedom now has become a, you know, a political argument. Does he owe any money to society or does he not? Or, you know, is he living for himself or is he living to give back to society, which is what society would expect from him.
Yeah. So what I believe you're saying is that people believe that their rights extend to the right to violate the rights of others.
Yes, exactly. And we're getting back to, you know, I have my rights to have my slaves. You know, when slavery was going to get abolished and people were screaming that, you know, you're taking my rights away. I have rights to have slaves. And no, you don't. And you also do not have rights to have capitalist slaves because people are not your slaves. You do not own people. You do not own people's money. You do not own people's bodies. You do not own people's life. Because people.
Nice. I like that, Xenia. I saw some passion coming out of you there. You're tired of being robbed, I can tell. Nice.
Yeah. Well,
I see Carlos up there laughing in the corner too.
Well, I'm not very well versed on Ayn Rand. I have read a little bit of her things, you know, the main things I'm learning. This is what I'm learning every day. But I have actually had these the concept of it I've had my whole entire life. And I think I told you the story where when I first went to university, there was riots outside
Yes.
about, you know, having free education. And my dad asked me, well, you know, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to a riot because, you know, they're starting to introduce university fees, and I think university should be free. And he looked at me and he said, Xenia, does the government owe you an education? And I immediately just said, no. And I put my bag down and went into my room. But what was funny was that when I thought, wow, revelation, you know, my dad's so smart, you know, he made me think in a way that I've never thought before. The government does not owe me an education. I couldn't rationalize any kind of way that the government, where I think the government owes me an education without me paying for it. So I thought that was very, very smart. I couldn't wait to get to university to tell all of the other people. So I walked in and said, wait, guys, you know what? The government does not owe you an education. And that they looked at me like I was, you know, just fell off the planet. So they didn't have the same revelation. They argued that the government did owe them an education, but not in a rational way. It was in a rationalized way. I remember one guy, Victor, I was having an argument with him on the uni campus, and he said, well, okay, right, okay, have it your way. If the government does not owe us an education, then they owe us a job after we paid for this education. And I said, well, actually, they don't owe you a job either. And he said, well, then why are we doing this? And I said, because you're choosing to. And
well, Xenia, can I just say, Xenia, you may not be well versed in Ayn Rand, but you do have an abundance of common sense, and I think you're well versed in being robbed by your government.
Oh, yes, that I am. I know. And you said 37%. It's 47% in Australia. We're very socialist. 47%,
good grief.
yeah, of wages above a certain amount go to the government. And then there's goods and services tax, and you know, there's everything you do is absolutely taxed.
Ugh.
So they're taxing the middle class into poverty. That's what they're doing. If you're middle class right now, you're not middle class, you're poor.
No, it was worse in this country.
Bloody awful to me.
The very people who are being affected and deprived of accumulating wealth are the very ones that continue to ask for those kind of policies to be implemented in their legislatures. But the thing that gets me a lot is that, you know, you can pass a law and everything looks pretty. But
Carlos, Carlos, can I interrupt you, buddy? Can you explain to the viewer what's happening here with these people passing behind you? They might be, you know, the guy watching at home might be a bit confused as to what is going on.
Yeah.
So I am in a transitional house. This is where they put you after you're released from prison, in order to help you. But I'm finding that they're more an obstacle than help. So this is why you can see this is actually an example of what's going on in my actual life.
Well, let's say hello to them every time. Next time they walk in, let's all say hello.
But no, Xenia, if I walked up to every single person and outside of, you know, the law told them, give me some money, you owe me an education, nobody would go for that. It's complete crap.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, somehow through the government, through laws, everything seems to be disguised, and everybody just says, you know, the government. But the government doesn't exist apart from the individuals whose wealth has to be taken away in order to, you know, distribute that wealth. Whenever you say government, you're talking about people who are individuals, not something completely apart from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And incidentally, I studied medical research at university, and when I did a postdoctoral fellowship in Canada, actually for for 3 years. When I was getting ready to go, the Australian government brought in this affirmative action plan into Australia, where they would only employ female scientists. And there was this brilliant scientist that across where my laboratory was, just across the hall, there was this brilliant neuroscientist. He was doing research for about 30 years. He was published. His research was spot on. It was fantastic. He didn't get any funding. And the person that got the funding for neuroscience was somebody who was my age, so barely 25 at that time, just straight out of a PhD, no runs on the board, no experience, no lab. She didn't have any employed scientists. She didn't have any publications, but she got all of the funding based on the fact that she was a young female scientist. And I remember I just accepted a job in Canada, so I was getting ready to leave. And one of my professors came up to me and said, Xenia, some good news. When you decide to come back to Australia, you'll always be employed in science because they have an affirmative action plan going. They want more female scientists within science. And I looked at him and I said, you know what, Terry, that is absolutely disgusting. And
bravo, Xenia.
Yeah. So he was shocked. He was shocked at my, and he said, why? It's good for you. And I said, well, actually, it actually is not good for me because it's not based on merit. It's not based on merit. It's not based on achievement. It's based on gender. So if that is the case, then I'm writing a research grant and I have absolutely no idea whether it's going to go through or not based on the work. That means that you can be a fantastic scientist, do all of the right things, get all of the right publications, get into top medical journals, and still not get a grant because the wrong equipment is between your legs. It's just bad.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's just bad. So, and I said to him, all right, so it's favoring me right now because I'm female. What if they decide to say, well, we're only funding gay females or, gay men or black people or purple people or, people with blue eyes or whatever? It's got to be based on merit. Because if it's not based on merit, then the ground underneath you is absolutely shaky in medical research. It should never be like that.
It should not. And I think that we can kind of tie that back to the beginning of the conversation as far as what is capitalism. And capitalism is the system whereby it's private ownership of the means of production, which means that people are free to own whatever property that they can create, accumulate, and then they're also free to trade that with others without molestation from government or criminals. And that's what capitalism is. And I think its justification is rooted in the objectivist ethics of egoism and individual rights. And it's the only system that protects those rights. Bravo, capitalism. And bravo, Xenia. You've done an excellent job at explaining a lot of these concepts and putting them into human terms. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we've been talking for an hour, guys, and I think we're running out of time. Do either of you have any final remarks for the listener before we...
Well, I do. Listener, keep listening, keep watching. We've got a lot more where this came from. I hope you enjoyed it.
And I would say that if you can't do something in your own personal relationships, then don't advocate the government to do it to everybody either.
Nice. That's a mic drop moment.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for listening. And please like and subscribe. And if you've got any questions, write them in the group chat. I'm going to put this in the group chat. And Michael and Carlos, I'm sure will answer all of your questions. Thank you and goodbye.